Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a second here and make sure that everyone can see us. We are testing out some new technology tonight at the Adams County Historical Society. I'm Andrew Dalton, the Executive Director, and we have here with us tonight Tim Smith, our Collections Manager and Historian. I'm very excited for Tim's presentation tonight, as I'm sure you all are. Let us know if you can hear us. Looks like we're good. Whoop. We are good. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Tim real quick. Tim is a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg National Military Park. He's the author of 10 books about the Battle of Gettysburg and the local citizens. And he's written numerous articles about the Battle of Gettysburg and Adams County history. Tonight, I just want to start by pointing out that this talk is based on an article that Tim wrote in Volume 2 of Adams County History, which is available for purchase on our website. We're going to put a link in the comment section at some point here tonight. But it was written in 1996, which happens to be the year that I was born. So if you didn't already know that Tim's an old guy, there's more evidence for you. But it is an excellent article if you haven't had a chance to read it. Tim details all of the buildings in the town that still have lasting battle damage, which is the title of our program tonight. And so we're going to go through that, discuss these buildings and the civilians, the townspeople that lived in them and wrote about them. I wanted to start with a quote from Tim that I find really compelling in the first part of his article. He wrote, "For the Gettysburg civilians, the true horror of war was the constant fear that one of these shells might crash through their wall, explode in their home, and kill members of their family. It does not take a great knowledge of Civil War tactics to understand and appreciate that fear." So, without further ado, first I just want to ask you, Tim, how did you become interested in documenting the battle damage in Gettysburg? And it seems like you're the first one who really made an accurate tally of all of the houses that have projectiles in them.
Well, I think it started when I became a guide, and I noticed how excited people would get when you drove by a building that had an artillery shell in it or had bullet holes in the side of it. And you pointed it out to them, and they'd ask questions about it. And as I went around the battlefield, I noticed in the town, I noticed other buildings that had battle damage. And talking to other guides, I asked about the different buildings and if they knew anything about them. And I realized that there didn't seem to be anyone who even knew like how many buildings actually had artillery shells in them, or what the names of the buildings were, or who lived there, or any of the stories of the shells. No one had collected all the information. Different people knew about this building or that building, or some of the battle damage, but I wanted to just kind of pull together all the information we had about the buildings in the borough.
Right. Well, let's get right into that now. So I am going to bring up our presentation for tonight. And so let's just start with some information about how you did this study, what the parameters were, and maybe some more famous shots like we have up on the screen here of places where battle damage was extremely visible at the time and is still visible today.
Yeah, this is the Troxel farm on the Gettysburg battlefield, and the barn to this day, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, has a hole in it where a cannonball went through the barn during the fighting. And, I do lots of tours every year with 8th graders, and I always stop the bus at this point and I point over at the hole in the barn. And, it's interesting to me, even to this day, I've seen it hundreds of times, but the excitement that people get when they look over and then they see the hole in the barn and realize it was caused by a cannonball during the fighting. It's just really intense. Now, years ago, the Forney farm stood on the first day's battlefield, and the John Forney farm was sort of dilapidated and removed by the national park about 1937. But when they removed the building, the rafters of the building were placed in the old Rose and Steel Museum. And you might notice today, the rafters are at the museum at the Gettysburg Foundation, and you can see there is a hole through the rafters in which a projectile during the battle. Supposedly they were caused by the projectile during the battle. But people stop there and look up at the rafters in the museum, in the old museum too, and just are amazed by it. Now, most of the damage on the battlefield or in the town is not artillery shells. It's caused by bullets, by rifle fire. And there's lots of places that you can see on the battlefield itself where there is visual battle damage or lasting battle damage. This is the Shriver house, the earliest known photograph of the Shriver house, and it has bullet holes in the side of it. But also along the northern side of the house, there are 3 cherry trees. And during the battle, a cannonball was lodged in one of the cherry trees. And you can actually see photographs of this. There's lots of photographs of it. I think I've seen maybe 10 different images from starting in the 1880s until about 1920 of the cannonball in the cherry tree. And you get the idea that Joseph Shriver set up a peach stand selling peaches right next to the tree of the cannonball. And he would tell people, come on, come over and look at my cannonball in the building. And then, sell peaches. He was a very enterprising farmer with the tourists. But this tree sort of died, and the cannonball was removed. And eventually the cannonball was actually donated to the Adams County Historical Society, where today, as part of my regular daily duties, I am sort of the caretaker and protector of the Shriver cannonball. Here's an interesting article I found. It's from 1897. And I really like this article because it talks about the buildings in the town that have artillery shells in them. And it mentions, if a shell lodged in a house is there still, if it happens to be necessary to repair the house, carpenters are instructed not to disturb the shell. If a new house goes up on the site of an old one, it is 10 to 1 that the shell is carefully removed in its case of wood and placed in the new house as near its former location as possible. Now, we don't have any specific example of that, but we're going to talk about there's kind of a couple of examples we're going to talk about that are close to this. And I think that's interesting. So in 1897, people were looking at the shells in the buildings in town, and they were interested in the shells. Here's another article. This is from 1903, where a tourist is going from the railroad depot in Gettysburg up to Cemetery Hill. And you can see he passes points of interest, like, of course, the Jennie Wade house, which was a big tourist attraction early on, and also the place where General Schmucker had hid, near the Garlic House. And then he mentions the houses of the town still show the marks of the battle, and a shell was noticed embedded in one of the brick walls from which the fuse and powder had been removed. So, we hope that each of the shells that's still in the building in town has been removed at some point, and the powder and the fuse taken out, and then put back into the building, hopefully. Now, I should mention that the Farnsworth House on Baltimore Street, a lot of tour guides drive by this house and point out the bullet holes, because on a bus tour, we're going down Baltimore Street, and it's easy to point this building out and show the bullet holes. And, people are generally, it's early in the tour, and they can see that the town still shows visible battle damage. And let's go to the next one. And you can see in this view on the left, the bullet holes inside the building. And I highlighted on the right at the bottom, the owner of the Farnsworth House, Loring Schultz, actually paints the bullet hole to make it look white, so you can see their bullet holes. I should mention, going around town, I'm not an expert on what is a bullet hole in a building and what is maybe a piece of brick that has fallen out of a building. And people always ask me, oh yeah, what do you think? Is that a bullet hole? And I don't know. I mean, it would be really difficult to go around town and say, you look for individual bullet holes in individual Civil War buildings. There must be, 200 buildings in town today that were there at the time of the battle. And possibly, there's a bullet hole in each one somewhere, on the outside of it. It's possible. but it's really difficult to tell. At least the ones that were in the main part of the battle, you can look at them and say, wow, that's pretty amazing. Now, I wanted to mention with the Farnsworth House also, it used to have an artillery shell sticking out of it. And I remember when Loring Schultz first told me this, I don't know if I believed it or I thought maybe, well, I don't know about that. But since he discussed this with me and I found several photographs, here's one, and you can see there is a artillery shell protruding from the wall up near the top of the building, just to the left of the attic window. And for a while, that building was painted white. People didn't really notice the bullet holes as much when it was painted white. You can see there's a sign. This is a 1936 photograph, but there's a sign near the house, and it says bullet holes in wall, and has an arrow pointing to the wall with the bullet holes in it. Of course, on the second and third day of the battle, there was a violent sharpshooter action at the edge of the town. And sharpshooters from both sides were firing back and forth at each other. And a large amount of the buildings in this area suffered battle damage. And the ones that were not replaced do still show visible battle damage. Here's this photograph we just had up was Gettysburg in November 1863, and these are photographs taken during the procession leading to the National Cemetery, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. But you can see in these photographs the edge of the town of Gettysburg as it appeared in 1863. And in this image, on the left of the image is the Rupp Tannery with the smokestack, and then just down a little bit, and we're just north of where Steinway Avenue comes in today. We can see the Farnsworth House, which is the Sweeney House at the time of the battle. And then beyond it is a little white house, the Homan House. And then we have the Benner House and the Garlick House and the Shriver House and the Pierce House up the street. And all of these buildings suffered some battle damage because of the sharpshooter action. Here is the Homan House. From an 1888 photograph. This is from the Henry Stort collection at the Adams County Historical Society. And you can see he was actually recording a photograph of the front section of the house, illustrating the fact that it had bullet holes in it. And here's a close-up of that view, and you can see some of the bullet holes above the window and beside the window in this image.
So we have someone wondering about Jennie Wade's death and how, whether or not the bullet that killed Jennie Wade would have come from one of these houses.
Absolutely. Now, obviously there were dozens of sharpshooters all over the southern edge of the town, and, we could speculate and tell you where the bullet came from, but undoubtedly the bullet came from one of these sharpshooters at the edge of the town. The earliest known account that talks about where the bullet came from mentions it came from the Rupp Tannery. And then, of course, behind the Rupp Tannery is the Sweeney House. And, a lot of people, came to believe that it was fired from the attic window of the Sweeney House as time went on. But the point is that during the death of Jennie Wade, there were dozens of sharpshooters all over the edge of the town firing up, and dozens of sharpshooters all around the Jennie Wade house. So it could have come from one of several locations. And there hasn't been a real good study done on where the bullet came from. That would be a neat documentary, don't you think? Where did the bullet come from? So, or who killed Jennie Wade? So here's another photograph of the Homan House from about 1890. And today there's the front part of the house, maybe it's 1880s photograph, because the front part of the house, I think it's the late 1880s. There's a brick section on the front, but this is the original William Homan House, and the bullet holes were just around the side of it. And beside it is the Sweeney House on Baltimore Street. Just get a better idea of that South Street going in between the two houses where we're talking about with Homan. Now on Baltimore Street and Lefevre Street, there was a fence. And there's a sign here, and it says on the sign to the right of this image, just near our photographs, it says bullet holes preserved in fence for visitors. And there, from the time of the battle until the 1920s or 30s, there was this fence along the entrance to what is now the middle school. And it was filled with bullet holes. And that's the Samuel McCreary house on Baltimore Street. And today this area is referred to as Unity Park. And you can, people were just amazed by this fence. I found actual articles in the newspaper where people were writing home and described the fence on Baltimore Street from the sharpshooter action. And we have a bunch of photographs of this particular fence. And I think here in this show, I put together the largest collection of bullet hole fenced views of this image or this location ever seen. Okay, here's a Henry Stewart photograph of the fence from 1888. And again, he's pretty simple in his captions: bullet holes in fence.
And Tim, a portion of the fence is currently still in the collections of a private dealer or collector in the area, right? There is still an existing.
I'm not sure exactly when the fence was removed from Baltimore Street, but prior to it becoming in the possession of the Gettysburg School District. But the section of the fence, the first two sections of the fence, were actually sold to Lee's headquarters. Clyde Daly opened up Lee's headquarters as a museum in the 1920s. I have no idea when the fence was moved up there, but when I was a kid in the 70s, and probably, I'm sure some other people probably remember in the 60s it being there, that fence was there at Lee's headquarters, at two sections of the fence on display. And then when Lee's headquarters sold in the 1990s, a private collector purchased the fence. And I actually know the guy, it's in his basement, and so it still exists, this portion of the fence that was there at the time of the battle. Here's another picture of the fence, and this one's from Unity Park, looking actually towards the brick section of the home and house that was placed on there in the late 1880s, I believe. And let's get to the next one. Here's a modern image from that same location, just so you can kind of see where we're talking about.
We should give a shout out to our friends at Mr. G's Ice Cream.
Because we're going to talk about that now.
We are right at the site.
And here's a photograph of the bullet holes in the fence with the Weinbrenner house behind it. We're looking across Lefevre Street. And of course, today that's Mr. G's ice cream, old-fashioned homemade ice cream. And here's another view of that. And these two images came from Mr. G's lobby. He's a good friend of ours. And, they illustrate, again, the fence. And these are both, they're dated. Off the top of my head, I think they're from 1919. And here's a 1960s view of the Weinbrenner house. John Weinbrenner lived there. And there are bullet holes in the house. And there's a great account by a student from the Lutheran Seminary who's hiding in the cellar of that house during the fighting with the Weinbrenner family. Just writes an extraordinary account of what it was like to hide in one of these houses during the battle and have sharpshooters above you firing out from the doors and windows. And Mr. G does have that account hanging on his lobby wall if you go in his ice cream shop. And you can see here's one of his windows, and you can see there's bullet holes in the shutters. Of course, the shutters would have been closed. And then there's bullet holes in the brick wall around the shutters. And the Garlick house, Henry Garlick lived on Baltimore Street. And the Garlick house has bullet holes inside of it. Now, the Garlicks, unlike the Farnsworth house where the bullet holes are painted white, or the Stock house, for instance, where the building's painted silver and you can see the bullet holes are more difficult to detect if they're not highlighted. But there are bullet holes in the side of the Garlick house and a bunch of them around that window near the top of the house. The McLean house, or the Jennie Wade house, where George Wade McLean rented at the time of the battle, actually owned by John Houck, same guy who owned Devil's Den. The house where Jennie Wade was killed, of course, it has bullet holes in the side of it. And in early accounts of the Jennie Wade house, they suggested there might be like 150 bullet holes in the house, which is just a crazy amount. Of course, the most famous bullet holes are the bullet holes through the door, which killed Jennie Wade. And again, there are probably many more buildings in town that have bullet holes in them, but no one's ever really taken on that study to try to determine what a bullet hole is and what a bullet hole isn't and where they are. Now, the Dobbin house, although stone, really doesn't show bullet holes well. The bullet chips a piece off and it wears. And so stones are not the same as bricks. But on the Dobbin house, at the south gable of the Dobbin house, and this is a view from Washington Street, looking across Washington Street towards the Dobbin house and towards Cemetery Hill. You can look at the south gable of the house above the stone, and it is brick, and it is perforated bullet holes on that south gable. So you can actually see marks of the battle on the Dobbin house as well. Now, my study is more about the buildings in town that still have artillery shells sticking out of them. And, that's a lot easier than trying to determine whether a mark in a building is from a bullet during the battle or not. We're actually talking about things that are sticking out of the building that you can actually see. Now, when I first determined I would do a study like this, I talked to people. I decided, what was an artillery shell, what was not an artillery shell. There were several people told me locations where they said there were shells, and it turns out to be just a pipe sticking out of the wall, and it wasn't a shell. So I wanted to determine if it was an artillery shell. I had a person who was an expert on artillery tell me what kind of artillery shell was sticking out of each of the walls. And then I tried to determine a little bit about the building during the Civil War. Was the building standing during the battle? That's an important thing if it has an artillery shell sticking out of it. And then, of course, is there a specific account by the family who lived there of an artillery shell hitting the building during the battle? So there's a lot of different things I wanted to include in this study. But I decided I would just do the borough, just what is in the borough of Gettysburg. And so I came with 9 buildings in the borough that have artillery shells. When I say in the borough, here's the Benner farm. And the Benner farm does have an artillery shell sticking out of the back of the house. And it is from the battle, and whether it was cemented in later or not, I'm not sure, but it does have an artillery shell sticking out of it. And but it's in Strabane Township. So I'm not counting ones that are on the battlefield, or we're just talking about in the borough. And so the first and second buildings that we're going to talk about are on Stratton Street, North Stratton Street, 1 and 2 in our study. And this is number 1, and this is the Kuhn house. And this is a Hotchkiss shell that is sticking out of it. It's been a while since I've talked about this. John Kuhn is the owner of the brickyard that is not far from this house. And that, of course, is today what we refer to as Coster Avenue. And that's where the mural of the fighting that occurred on the afternoon of July 1st exists. And he owned that property. This is a Civil War house. I think it was, this is an 1859 house off the top of my head. And we don't have a specific account about the artillery shell in this building, but I was able to find a 1908 account by a New York veteran that comes back to Gettysburg that mentions that there's an artillery shell sticking out of the house at that time. One of the things was I wanted to try to determine whether these artillery shells were really from the battle and had flown and just stuck in the building, or if they were cemented in there later. And some of them obviously are cemented in later, but usually they're cemented in to mark where an artillery shell struck the building during the fighting. So across the street is the Barbihan house. I should mention that the Kuhn house is at 221 North Stratton Street, and across the street at 218 North Stratton Street is the Barbihan house. And this house is built about 1861, and 2 different families were living there. The family of the Barbihan family and the family of George Crass, if I believe correctly. It's been a while since I've spoken about this specifically. But down the side of the building, there is an artillery shell sticking out of it. It's not easy to see. It's on the north wall of the building, and it is a 3-inch reed shell sticking out of the building. Number 3 is right near the square of Gettysburg, and it is the Wills building. I think we generally refer to this as, and again, it's a building that was constructed just prior to the Civil War by David Wills. I remember when the park was doing the Wills House project, it was discovered that this building, which was designed as storefronts just prior to the war, and the Wills House itself had a common basement. They didn't have a wall. You just walked from the basement all along both of the buildings, which is kind of really odd. But David Wills owned this, not only the house where he lived, where Lincoln stayed when he came to give the Gettysburg Address on the right, but also you can see I took this photograph during the reconstruction of the Wills House, but also he had these 2 buildings that were the storefronts there on the left. Now, in the second floor of this building, on the right-hand side or the west side, was the Tyson Brothers Photographic Studio at the time of the battle. And in this case, we have a specific account where a soldier was friends, a soldier that had served in the 10th New York Cavalry that was stationed in Gettysburg in 1861, 1862, was good friends with one of the Tysons, and had written an article about the battle later, and had a letter from Tyson in his article, and Tyson described the artillery shell in the building. Andrew, do you want to read that?
Yeah, sure. So we have the quote from Tyson. We found the gallery undisturbed. The wife of lawyer David Wills claimed to have prevented the men from going into the gallery by telling them it was dangerous. They, however, entered the cellar and emptied a barrel of 95% alcohol. I had a gross of 8-ounce bottles, and they were seen carrying these bottles out filled with alcohol. The shell has never been removed. It is still there just as it was, ready to blow somebody up perhaps sometime or other. A mini ball passed through the back window, which was raised, passing through both panes of glass, cutting a round hole through the first pane without cracking the glass. So it's a fascinating account we have of this house. And I'm sure many of you know this property as the Cannonball Malt Shop, which it used to, I think it's closed now, but we do have a picture that Tim's provided of the Cannonball Malt Shop.
And I'm sorry to see the Cannonball Malt Shop closed. I knew the owners pretty well. And we had sort of a running argument or discussion about it. It was kind of a running joke about it. And I would send people to the Cannonball Malt Shop, and I would have them go up to the person at the counter and say, that's not a cannonball. Of course, it's an artillery shell. And I had lectured them endlessly on the incorrect name of their ice cream shop. It should have been the Artillery Shell Malt Shop and not the Cannonball Malt Shop. I don't think they thought it had the same appeal or ring, though. But
and this is one of the more authentic shells, though, in the town. As you'll continue to discuss, though. I think from the account, it's pretty clear that this is an original shell, that it's still in place from where it hit or near where it hit the building.
Yeah, and again, hopefully, at some point they pulled that out. They took the fuse out, took the powder out, and cemented it back in. You can see the cement around the place where it hit. And from the direction, of course, it looks like this came from around Oak Hill, which would make perfect sense.
Right.
Like on the first day of the battle. But it would be really awkward if one of these buildings still had powder in it and the building caught on fire or something like that. Black powder is very unstable, and we're always wondering about these types of things. But theoretically, all these shells have been removed and the powder taken out and then cemented back in.
Right. You wouldn't want to live in a house with a live shell.
So number 4 that we'll talk about, let's see, Well, it's
But
funny that
we have one question. Was the malt shop an embalming station after the battle? Was there any embalming done at that site that we know of? I mean, I guess everywhere
not
becomes
embalming. That
okay.
I've never heard anything like that there.
Right, right. But of course,
Because of
just
the
about every
chemicals,
structure. Yeah,
I
I'm not
wonder.
sure. Maybe with the
Well, I guess what they might be referring to is the fact that there are storefronts that Wills rents out at the time of the Civil War there, and there is an account where maybe Wills rents to an embalmer.
okay,
So that's
very
probably what
good.
you're referring to. But do I know? Off the top of my head, I do not know if it's there. Might be mentioned in the Wills House Museum that an embalmer, for a short time after the battle, makes a business renting one of his storefronts. So this is the Gettysburg Female Institute. This is the school run by Rebecca Eyster at the time of the Civil War. Now this building is probably built around 1813, 1814. It's been used as a classical school. And then also it became the first home of the Lutheran Theological Seminary. And then it was later the first home of the Gettysburg College or Pennsylvania College. And then it was a girls' school at the time of the battle. So it'd been used for school purposes most of its history. And during the fighting, it was used as a hospital during and after the battle. And a reed shell hit the building and stuck in the building. I have been in this building. We were the owner of this building is a very good friend of the Adams County Historical Society, and we've known him for years. I've been up to the room. There is a bulge inside of the room, right where you'd expect, where the bricks are pushed in, where the artillery shell hit. The damage around the bricks, it appears to me that this shell hit the building, stuck in it, and has been there ever since. It doesn't seem like this is something that's been placed in there or redone in any way. It's fascinating in that respect. And here's a photograph from the 1880s, a William Tipton photograph. It's actually, this is an interesting photograph because it's taken from the other side of the street, from Solomon Powers' granite yard, which was located on the corner of Washington Street and West High Street. And we're looking south across the stone yard, across High Street, and then at the Academy building itself. And of course, this is in the Gettysburg College history because they were highlighting the history of the college. But if you look between the top middle windows, you can see where it appears the artillery shell is sticking out of it during this photograph. And we have a close-up. And you can kind of see the damage on the building. And that is right where the shell is. I wish we had a clearer version of this that we could actually look at it and say, yes, that's the same shell. But I feel pretty confident it is. Now, number 5, let's see. Oh, number 5 is the Gettysburg Methodist parsonage. And another building I'm very familiar with. I've talked about this building for years, but even before, one of our licensed battlefield guides lives there now. Again, I've been inside this building. It's fascinating, and this one has an explosive cannonball, a shell or case shot, I guess you'd say, a 12-pounder cannonball, a shell or case, and you can see the hole in the front where the fuse would go. And now it's fascinating looking at this building. You can look at the front of it and you can tell right away that that doesn't look like a Civil War building. And let's go to the next one. This is a photograph of the building from the 1880s. Again, a Henry Stort photograph. Henry Stort lived on Baltimore Street. And so he took a lot of photographs of the buildings along the street. And I've showed, this is the third one of his I've showed already. But you can see the case shot sticking out of the building just to the right of the top window. And what happened was, at some later point, I don't know if I have the exact date or not, they actually renovated the building. And as that article mentioned from 1897, the carpenters were told to, pull the shell out. And then when they renovated, they replaced the shell at the same spot where, the building, the original shell was sticking out of the building. Now, this is kind of interesting because this house, we have a specific account about the artillery shell hitting the house. And this is the kind of thing that I was looking for when I decided I would do this article. And I hope, Andrew, you probably have the article there ready. You can read the quote.
Yeah, we do have. So the quote is about Laura Bergstresser, who's the minister's daughter. She was 13 years old at the time of the battle. Like many families, before they were, in the cellar, they were, still wondering about the house as the battle is going on. And from across the street, Tilly Pierce was watching out her window directly across at the Bergstresser house. And she wrote, "During the first day's battle, after our men had retreated, a little girl was standing at the second-story window of the house opposite ours. She had the shutters bowed and was looking down into the street and confusion below. Suddenly, a shell struck the wall just beside the shutter, tearing out a large hole and scattering pieces of brick, mortar, and plaster all around the room in which the little girl was standing. It entered and struck some places of the room and then rebounded and fell out into the street. Another ball is now placed in the wall to mark the place where the first one struck. I am here reminded of the fact that many persons, while walking or riding past this place and having their attention called to the shell sticking in the wall, neatly encased in brick and mortar, think that it has been there just as it arrived on the first day of the battle. Shells were not quite so tidy in introducing themselves at that time." The little girl who had this narrow escape referred to as Laura Bergstresser, daughter of the Methodist minister in Gettysburg. So an excellent quote and story. And then, of course, there's another story that Tim includes here in this article from one of her brother, one of Bergstresser's sons, writing, "The rebel sharpshooters occupied the roof of the parsonage during the battle. Some years after, when balls of carpet rags that were hanging in the garret were unwound, many bullets were found. A shell struck the parsonage over the second-story window, throwing quite a quantity of brick and mortar into the room. My sister Laura was standing at the window. The shell rebounded into the street and is now, I think, cemented in the wall." So two really wonderful accounts of this house and the shell that struck, although today the shell, as Tim has pointed out, is not exactly in the right spot.
Okay. So where are we at? Number 6? Number 6, the Schmucker house. Oh, and I wanted to mention that we'll put that map that I just showed, we'll put it on our Facebook site tomorrow. And so if anybody wants to, they can get that image and print it out and then use that map to go around town.
We do have just a couple questions. Someone's asking, was there any concern digging the graves at Gettysburg that they would encounter live shells? And I think, I don't know if we have any accounts of that, but we certainly have a wealth of accounts of live shells on the battlefield. And shortly afterwards, the children and young people in Gettysburg went out and gathered as many relics as they could to sell to tourists. And there were, several, maybe I think Tim would know the exact number, but at least 5 or 6 incidences where the shell exploded and either killed or severely wounded the person who had been trying to gather the relics.
And there's an account by David Martin Luther Weichert, and he claims that his plow hit an artillery shell and it exploded and blinded him. But it turns out he is actually blinded working with dynamite when he's working on the railroad behind Little Round Top. So, but it sounded better that his plow hit the artillery shell. But since they specifically asked about digging graves, Brian Kennel, my good friend, who's the superintendent of the Evergreen Cemetery, I don't know if it was him personally or his father, but in the Evergreen Cemetery, there are 2 artillery shells they have on display that were found while they were digging the graves. More modern, but yes, obviously. And, so artillery shells occasionally are found around town during construction projects. And so I know a few of them. But they haven't exploded when people hit them with their shovel or anything like that.
We have one other question just about the Eyster building. If the shell was never really touched after it hit, does it still contain powder?
I don't know. Good question.
Maybe we should check with the owner.
Again, theoretically, all these artillery shells have been pulled out. They've been emptied of their powder and replaced. I was just pointing out with that one, it man, does it look like it hit at that exact spot and did a lot of damage to the wall. Now, here's one that obviously was cemented in there later, because at the Schmucker house, there were once windows on the south side of the house. And right where there used to be a window, it's bricked in, and there's an artillery shell cemented into the area right near where the window and the wall met. And I suspect it's meant to mark the site of where an artillery shell hit during the battle. I have been in this house also. You can see the damage in the bricks around it. And this would be the, I'm not an artillery person, but the sabot of the back of the artillery shell. And, this is a 10-pounder Parrott shell. So, the front of it should be sticking out of the wall inside the building, and it's not. So, I don't know the exact story here. If you pull that out, are we going to find that it's just the end of the shell and it's not the whole shell? It's interesting. This is the home of Samuel Simon Schmucker, of course, the first professor of the Lutheran Theological Seminary, and this is up on Seminary Ridge, actually not far from our headquarters here at the Adams County Historical Society. And this Schmucker wrote an account about the damage of the seminary after the battle was over. And I think he mentions in his account, and Andrew probably has it there, that there were Confederate artillery pieces placed near his house firing at Cemetery Hill, and it drew artillery fire towards his house. And I think he might mention it got hit 13 times by artillery shells during the battle, which makes a lot of sense. So this shell marks where one hit.
Now, right, we do have a quote: 13 cannonballs or shells pierced the walls and made holes, several of which were from 2 to 3 feet in length and nearly as broad. Window frames were shattered to pieces, and the greater part of the glass in the house was destroyed.
Yeah, and so this one definitely is cemented into a spot that used to be a window. You can tell that when you look at, you can't tell in the photograph, when you're out there and you look on the brick pattern, you can tell that there were 2 windows that were just, they decided to take them out and just brick them in. And one interesting thing about this artillery shell, I remember when I did my article that it just came out in 1996, and Professor Wentz at the Lutheran Seminary, Fred Wentz, his father had lived in that house, Abdel Wentz, and he wrote a history of the Schmucker house. And Fred had lived there for a while when he was a kid, and his dad lived there. And he told me that artillery shell was not in that building when he was a kid, as if, it was cemented in much more recently. But then I did talk to some old battlefield guys like Jim Tate, and Jim Tate said, no, it's been there for a long time. And I don't know one way or another who was right or who was wrong, but it's fascinating to me that an artillery shell can be in a building and the people who live there don't have a recollection it has an artillery shell in it. That seems so strange. But I guess in Gettysburg, that kind of thing, we got bullet holes in our buildings, it's just a natural occurrence.
So we have a question: how far away were the cannons that were firing these types of shells?
So, a rifled artillery shell can be fired 2 miles, maybe a little.
And we have a question kind of asking whether they were targeting civilian areas in any way. And I would say we don't have any evidence to suggest that, but a lot of the cannons firing here.
The thing about the artillery during the battle is cannons are firing from Seminary Ridge, all along Seminary Ridge, and in the fields north of town and east of the town, and northern cannons are south of the town, and the cannons are firing over the town. And remarkably, there are very few incidents where explosive shells land in the town and create a lot of damage. There's some buildings damaged, but no one in the town is killed by an artillery shell during the battle. No civilians.
That's remarkable.
Remarkable. So it's just Gettysburg's in a little bit of a dip, and they're firing over the town. And these artillery shells in the buildings are ones that drop short. Now, the Schmucker house, if you just look at a map of the battle and you see these Confederate artillery units on Seminary Ridge, you understand why that house drew fire from the Union Army. But no, they're not targeting these houses. It just happens to be shells falling short or just inadvertently hitting the buildings. Now, where were we? Number 7? Number 7 is one of my favorite artillery shells. And it's the David Troxel house on the 3rd block of Chambersburg Street. It's 221 Chambersburg Street. And the building, of course, today is painted purple. But if you look at where the elbow is there in the rain spout, there is a Schenkel shell sticking out of the building. And David Troxel lived here at the time of the battle. And there were a bunch of, he must have had a nice basement because a bunch of his neighbors assembled in his basement during the battle. And I don't know if I tried to come up with an exact count, but we have 2 different civilian accounts by people who were in the cellar of this house during the fighting. And according to one of them, there were 22 people in David Troxel's cellar. And on the 2nd day of the battle, an artillery shell hit the building while these people are in the cellar. And they hear it hit the building. They know an artillery shell has hit the building, and they just wait for it to explode. And it never explodes. And then after the battle, they go out, and the artillery shell is sticking out of the building unexploded.
Right, and we do have the quote there. So it comes from Sarah Broadhead's diary, who I think Tim will point out where she lived exactly, not too far, actually, just adjoining this property. Her diary is fascinating. One of the most, detailed primary sources that we have from civilians in Gettysburg. She wrote on July 2nd, about 4 p.m., the storm burst again with terrific violence. It seemed as though heaven and earth were being rolled together. For better security, we went to the house of a neighbor, Troxel, and occupied the cellar, by far the most comfortable part of the house. While there, a shell struck the house, but mercifully it did not burst, but remained embedded in the wall, 1/2 protruding.
That's just amazing. Now, again, if we look at this building, you'll notice, and the lady who, I should preface this, the lady who wrote that account that Andrew just quoted from, lived in the building directly to the right of it at the end of the Warren block. And Sarah Broadhead, she was a renter at the time. And I think, is that 219, 217? I forget the address of Sarah Broadhead's house, but she lived in the building just to the right in the image. But if you look at the David Troxel house, again, much like the Methodist parsonage on Baltimore Street, that doesn't really look much like a Civil War building. So let's go to the next image. Now, this is a photograph. It's an extreme enhancement of a photograph from Seminary Ridge. And this photograph is actually taken right out the front door of the Adams County Historical Society, right in our yard, looking across towards the town. And in this image, you can see the Warren block. We call it that big building in the center of the photograph. And all the way to the left of the building is Sarah Broadhead's house. And that empty space beside it is where the David Troxel house with the cannonball in it is located today. And right away, when I was researching this, I knew this. It wasn't like I didn't, I had to figure this out. I knew that that building wasn't there. Now, but if you look back from the street, no, I don't mean go back. If you look back from the street now, you'll see that Troxel House is there, but it sits back off the street. And in around, I don't remember what date, I suspect, around 1920, they put a huge front addition onto the house. And they obviously took the artillery shell out of the original section of the house, pulled it out and moved it around and put it back in the front section of the house where it is today. So, and if you go there today to that location, I've been in that location, and the back of that house still is there, but it's, that wall that they took the shell out of would be an interior wall in that house up in the attic today. Oh, and one thing more, since we got that slide, let's go back to the slide before that. The one with the Broadhead house. Okay, one thing I'd like to read, and there are quotes by people in the battle and civilians that you hear that over and over again are dramatic. And I got to tell you, one of my favorite quotes of all time is written by Sarah Broadhead about hiding in the basement of the house, not during the second day when the artillery shell hit, but the next day during the bombardment preceding Pickett's charge. And this quote has been used over and over again because it's so good. Again, the battle began with unearthly fury. Nearly all the afternoon, it seemed as if the heavens and earth were crashing together. The time that we sat in the cellar seemed long, listening to the terrible strife. More terrible never greeted human ears. We knew that with every explosion and the scream of each shell, human beings were hurried through excruciating pain into another world, and that many more were lying torn and mangled and lying in torment worse than death, and no one able to extend relief. The thought made me very sad and feel that if it was God's will, I would rather be taken away than live to see the misery that would follow. Some thought this awful afternoon would never come to a close. We knew that the rebels were putting forth all their might, and it was a dreadful thought that they might succeed. I think people have used that over and over again, but can you imagine being in a house and listening to the artillery shells flying over the town? And again, not knowing if one would hit the house you were in and explode and kill your family.
We have one question here about the Schultz house near us up on Seminary Ridge. If you've ever noticed any damage to the walls, fragments in the side of that house.
Recently. Someone told me that they had toured the house. It's for sale currently, and that there is a shell fragment sticking out of the eastern portion of the house. I had never ever heard that until this. Might be the same person asking that asked me last week, but that is a Civil War house, although it's been greatly renovated. And honestly, I never heard that, but I don't doubt that there are buildings around town that have battle damage in them today that I don't know about, because there's possibility of this. These things have just been forgotten. Okay, so we're on number, 8. Oh, and 8's near the center of the town also. It's the Moses McLean house. Moses McLean was one of the more prominent Gettysburg citizens at the time of the battle. He was a former United States congressman, had served a term in Congress. He was a lawyer in the town. He died shortly after the Civil War, but his house, and you can see from the photograph of the house, it's the old Zerfing's hardware store. Now, of course, it's the Christmas house. It's a place where you can buy Christmas ornaments every day of the year. But the front of the house has been renovated. It was renovated prior, or just around the time it was used as Zerfing's. But you can actually see that the side of the house is the original part of the house, and it's just been renovated a little bit. And there is a 20-pound parrot shell sticking out of the building, not far from the roof of the building on the side of it. So you can see that on Baltimore Street and Zerfing Alley. It's really easy to point out, and you can look for that if on your travels around town. Gotta use my bell. Here's a photograph of Baltimore Street from the square of Gettysburg, taken in 1863. And in this view, if you look down Baltimore Street, of course, you have the Schick building, or sometimes they call it the House of Bender, or I think it has a sign on it, the House of Time now. And you go beyond it where there's the Union Cigar Store, and then beyond that, the red brick building with an actual square pump in front of it. That's the Moses McLean house, and it's a 2.5-story building with dormer windows on it. Now, we have a specific account that the 20-pounder parrot shell that's sticking out of it today was cemented in there in the 1870s by George Stock, who opened a cigar store in the building. But he cemented it in to mark the place where a cannonball came through the attic wall at the time of the battle. And we do have an account of the cannonball hitting the building.
Right. So this is an account from Elizabeth McLean, She was 15 years old at the time of the battle. She wrote on Friday, which would have been July 3rd, "My mother said she would take the feather bed to the garret where the others were neatly packed away. She went up to get the place ready for it and came down to get someone to help carry it up. While she was down there, a loud crash and a shell came tearing through a 15-inch brick wall, striking a beam that supported the roof. Split in two, broke out a rung from the crib in which we had slept when children, and having spent its force, rolled down the stairs to the first landing. The garret was filled with a cloud of brick dust, and we thought it was on fire, but the shell did not explode." That's another original account. So
That's
this is
awesome.
one of hundreds of accounts that we preserve at the Historical Society from the local residents, some, as young as 15 or even younger, who are writing much later. I think this account's from 1908.
I also want to point out that, of course, J.L. Schick, John Lawrence Schick, had a store on the square of Gettysburg at the time of the battle. You can see in this photograph his sign over his door off to the right. And he has an interesting account of the battle. And I like his account. He mentions that he was so nervous during the first day of the fighting, he smoked 21 cigars.
That's one way to handle it.
So here is a picture of Moses McLean and his family. And this photograph is a group photograph recorded prior to his death. I think it's an 1869 photograph, and it's recorded in the Tyson Brothers studio. And it's interesting for me to look at this photograph and realize that between the two windows where the curtains are pulled down, there's an artillery shell on the outside of that window, on that wall. That's where the artillery shell is. And here's another picture of Moses McLean around 1870, taken in front of his house on Baltimore Street with his granddaughters sitting on the steps there. So our last one, number 9, is, of course, the Sheeds house. This house was built in 1862. And, generally it's referred to as the Carrie Sheeds house because Carrie Sheeds ran a girls' school out of this house at the time of the battle. But it was actually Elias Sheeds' house. He was the father and his wife, and he had 3 daughters and 4 sons at the outbreak of the war. And of course, Carrie, starting in 1860, late 1861, 1862, started a girls' school here. So there were also girls boarding here. Elias Sheeds had 4 sons that served in the Union Army. All 4 sons would end up dying as a result of the war. 2 died during the war and 2 died early on afterwards. Carrie died. She never married. Her sister Elizabeth died. She never married. There's a daughter, Louisa, who died early on after the war. There was one grandchild that eventually she died. She never married. So this particular family ceased to exist, as a direct result of the Civil War. They did not move on. But this house, let's go back one. This house does have, I want to show on the bottom right-hand side, an artillery shell sticking out of it. And it is the front part. It is the front. We're looking at the front of the shell. And of course, the story always was that this artillery shell came through the rear of the house, came through the front of the house and stuck in the wall. And I looked very hard for accounts of this artillery shell and perhaps an artillery shell hitting during the battle. We do have an account by a guy named Asa Hardman of the 3rd Indiana Cavalry, who was in that building as a hospital steward during the battle. And he mentions artillery shells hitting the house fired from Cemetery Hill. But of course, that would make it that would have it pointing in the other direction. And that makes a lot more sense. I was finally able to find an account by a visitor who came here during Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and was touring the battlefield and specifically mentioned that he stopped at Carrie Sheeds' school, and there was a large hole in the roof under the eave of the roof. So, in this one, I believe there's probably a hole there. They filled in the hole, they repaired it, and they put a cannon or an artillery shell in the wall to mark where an artillery shell hit during the battle. And but now, question?
Yeah, we do have a question. Just someone asking, was there an area of the town that was more, was more badly damaged than other areas? And I guess we'd say the southern part of the town, with all of the skirmishing and the fighting in the streets, there's a lot more damage from bullets. But do you think from shell fire that there's a certain area that's damaged more than others?
No, I think probably the damage at the southern edge of the town and from artillery fire and infantry fire is probably the worst. I just wanted to show that here's a photograph by Matthew Brady taken right after the battle of the side of the Sheeds house. And a bunch of people used to tell me, they would say, oh, well, the artillery shell came through the roof of the building and is sticking out the front of the building. And you can look at the roof, and although on the right side of the roof, there's a little black dot, that's just a dot on the image itself. There's no damage to the roof. So, it either came through all the way through the building and just stuck, or it was cemented in there later. And it seems more logical, but that one is. But again, it's cemented in to mark the spot where an artillery shell is known to have struck the building during the fighting. We don't know how much damage to the town there was after the battle that went unrecorded by photographs and was repaired. I think if we saw actual photographs of some other areas of the town and how damaged they were, we might be stunned, but we just don't have a record of it. And let's go to the next one. And the reason I say this is the Stock House on South Washington Street. So again, this is a house that has damage on the side of it. And, the guy who owns it years ago painted it silver. And it's really nice that he painted it silver because we can see the bullet holes. And this particular house, again, is one that tour guides ride by on their tours of the battlefield. It's easy to come off from the visitor center, ride down the Tawnytown Road into Washington Street to get to the first day's battlefield. And I used to do that. I used to come down this street a lot on my tours. I remember specifically, I had a tour with foreign exchange students, and a bunch of them were from France. And we were going down the street, and I pointed out this building, and I pointed out the bullet holes, and usually people are ooh and ah, but these kids started laughing. And I turned to their teacher and I said, what are they laughing about? And the teacher said, oh, every building in France has bullet holes in it. And it just struck me that maybe bullet holes in the building are not exciting to people from countries in which, sustained a lot of damage during wars. But this building, you can see the damage. And again, we have a specific account that this building was hit by artillery fire during the fighting. And the idea is that there were sharpshooters in the window. They were firing at Cemetery Hill, which had a clear view of this building at the time. And they rolled an artillery piece, according to the account, down off of Cemetery Hill, and they fired a case shot against the side of the building. And you can see the marks of the case shot on the building along with bullet holes. But we had this story, guides knew about it, we were telling the story, we have an idea of what the battle damage looks like. And then about 3 years ago, out of the blue, a Samuel Fisher Corley's photograph of this house appeared on eBay. And I don't think I was prepared to see that this building was much more substantially damaged than I had previously thought. There is a building that used to stand on Cemetery Hill near the Steinway Avenue, Emmitsburg Road intersection. It was owned by Sophia Devan during the battle. In her claims file, it mentioned that the house was horribly damaged during the battle, and that house was removed. We have no idea the damage that that house suffered or what that house looked like after the battle. But look at the damage of this structure immediately after the battle. And then, of course, they repaired that. You can still see holes, battle damage in the building, but nothing like that.
Right. And we do have, that actually answers a question we had, which was, were these shells actually that effective if they're just crashing into buildings and staying there? But, it is definitely the case that there are many, many, many more shells that are actually doing great damage to buildings in the town, like this one here.
And of course, here's a sort of a then and now view of that building and, the damage on it. And we'll go to the next one. And, you know, here at the Adams County Historical Society, I wanted to mention that that building actually looks a lot the same design as the Sweeney House or the Farnsworth House at the time of the battle. They have the exact same dimensions at the time of the battle, even with the attic window offset a little bit. The exact number of doors and windows on the building in the back of the house is the same. And of course, they were both severely damaged during the battle. And then here is an image of that stock house that I found from a 1903, I believe it is, tour book of the battlefield. So you can see it was something that people had pointed out, not just in recent years, but the battle damage is pointed out for years and years and years by tour guides. And here at the Adams County Historical Society, we do collect information about the town in the battle and the civilians who lived there at the time and what they went through. So if you're interested in learning more about this, you can always buy the journal article that we wrote about the building from our website. But if you get an opportunity, you might come up here and we have files with civilian accounts to describe what it was like to be in the town during the fighting.
Right. Thank you, Tim. And I just want to point out that let me put it back onto, if I can, the video here, so we can close things out. If you have a chance to, we'd really appreciate if you'd visit our website. It's www.achs-pa.org. You can sign up for our newsletter there. We put out a newsletter every month with all kinds of announcements about programs and hopefully an announcement about reopening when things are a little bit more normal. But we hope you'll take a chance to look at our website and scroll through some of our finding aids and databases that we have available for free on there. And if you enjoyed this presentation, please consider joining or making a small donation through our website. We'd really appreciate the support. But we'll be trying to bring these programs to you every week if we can for the next couple months here. So well, thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you, Tim, for sharing all this incredible research with everybody.